Our two tests inside the app.test.js file are looking pretty good, but there's just one last quick refactor I want to do inside of here. You'll notice that both of our tests right now have the exact same line of code right here and right here. So anytime that you're writing out multiple tests inside of a single file and start to notice that there's some common setup or some common code between both those tests, we like to extract that common logic to another helper function that is provided to us by Jest. This helper function is referred to as the BeforeEach function, and we like to use it to kind of abstract out or pull out logic that needs to occur for every single test inside this file. So let's do this refactor, and then we'll talk about what it's really doing for us. Above our first test inside this file, I'm going to call a function BeforeEach. And to that function, I'm going to pass an arrow function, like so. So any logic that we put inside of this function right here will be executed before this test and this test right here. So again, it's a great place to put some common setup logic. In this case, we're probably going to want to make sure that we initialize this wrapped variable right here before we get into either one of these tests. So I'm going to extract that variable up here to the BeforeEach statement. And then I can remove it from the second test as well. Okay, so this right here is almost 100% equivalent to what we had before. Before this test is executed, the BeforeEach statement will run, and it will initialize our new app component and assign it to this wrapped variable. This test will then execute. We'll look at that wrapped variable and try to do some expectation around it. Then, after this test has been completed, BeforeEach is ran a second time, and then we jump straight down to this test down here. So the word BeforeEach very literally means before every single test, we're going to do some common setup logic. Now before we try to run this code right here, there's one little issue with how we've written it. Remember how scoping of variables works with JavaScript. At present, we are defining a new variable called wrapped in the scope of this arrow function. So this wrapped variable right here is not in the same scope as wrapped right here and wrapped right here. They are in different scopes. And if we try to run this code as it stands right now, we'll get an error message saying that variable wrapped and wrapped are not found, or they are completely undefined. So to get around this, what we usually do is initialize our variable that we're making use of outside of the BeforeEach statement. So we would write above the BeforeEach, let wrapped, like so. Then inside the BeforeEach statement, we are not going to initialize the variable again. Instead, we will declare our new instance of the app and assign it to that wrapped variable. So now that wrapped is defined inside this outer scope, it is accessible within the BeforeEach statement, within this test, and within this test. And before each of these two tests, we're going to assign a new copy of our app component to that wrapped variable. Now the other thing I'll mention here very quickly is you'll notice that we're using the let keyword right here rather than the more typical const. The reason for that is that we are very clearly going to want to reassign the value to wrapped several times throughout this file. So when we first initialize the variable right here, we're saying, hey, we do not yet know what we want to assign to this variable just yet. So we're going to use let, which will allow us to reassign a new value to that variable several times throughout this file. Okay, so now last thing I'm going to do is save this file. I'll flip back over to my terminal. I'll check out my tests, and it looks like they're still passing. Perfect. So we're going to be using this BeforeEach construct throughout all the rest of the tests that we put together as a location that we do some common setup that needs to be done for every single test inside this file. Now, one thing that you might be curious about is whether or not BeforeEach is going to apply to any other tests inside of our project. And the answer is no. This BeforeEach right here is only going to apply to tests that we place inside this file. No other tests inside of our project. All right, so now that we've got this refactor done, let's continue in the next section and move forward with our application.